This is HuffPost Live. I'm Mike Sachs. The Supreme Court Citizens United decision freed up corporations and unions to spend unlimited sums out of their general treasuries on political activities, so long, of course, as that money did not go directly to political parties and candidates. That move, the freeing up of spending unlimited sums, of course, sparked plenty of controversy over corporate power to sway elections and sparked movements to amend the Constitution to reverse the decision. But more modest and more likely reforms have focused on disclosure rules that would shed light on the over $400 million of dark money spent by independent non-party outside groups last election. And to this, there's now a petition to the Securities and Exchange Commission asking the agency to require publicly traded companies to disclose their political spending to their shareholders. The SEC is expected to decide whether to take up the petition, which has now over 500,000 public comments, most in favor, any day now. Opponents, however, say such a rule is an improper effort to shame businesses out of their exercising legitimate First Amendment rights. And joining us to discuss this in our Google Hangout is Liz Kennedy, counsel at Demos, David Keating, president of the Center for Competitive Politics, Robert Jackson Jr., associate professor of law at Columbia University, and James Bopp Jr., founder of the Bopp Law Firm. So, Robert, I want to go to you first. What would be the practical effect of requiring corporate disclosure to their shareholders? Will it make any difference from your point of view?
Well, I think it'll make a critical difference. What our petition proposes is that the Securities and Exchange Commission mandate that every public company tell its shareholders when and how it uses shareholder money for political purposes. And I think this would make a significant difference for the following reason. I think there's good reason to expect that many public corporations spend money on politics in a way that shareholders wouldn't want. And I expect that having to disclose this type of spending would encourage public companies only to spend money on politics when it's the best thing for investors.
Now, the follow-up question I would have to that is, if the main purpose of a corporation is to maximize returns for the shareholders, and if the shareholders' main purpose in investing in a company is really to get maximum dividends back, then what does political spending have anything to do with the bottom line?
Sure. Well, I think that there are a number of ways in which political spending is likely to influence a corporation's bottom line. But the thing to see is, in general, in corporate law, we tend to trust directors and executives of public companies with maximizing profits and shareholder value when their interests are aligned with those of shareholders. But here's the thing. When it comes to politics, the interests of the insiders in the corporation might diverge from the interest of shareholders. The political views of the directors and executives who run public companies might be very different from the political preferences of their shareholders. And when we have a situation like that in corporate law, when there's a conflict between the insiders and the owners of the company, we tend to require disclosures so that shareholders can tell the directors and executives what they want and actually can remove the directors and executives if they're behaving in a way that's not consistent with shareholders' interests.
Now, David, I see you leaning forward. Let's take a little note there. I'm curious what you have to say.
Well, a lot of things. I mean, first of all, we have to keep in mind what the Securities and Exchange Commission is supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be protecting investors primarily from fraud and abuses, and there's a lot of evidence the agency hasn't done a very good job with that. The Bernie Madoff scheme is just one of many examples. So if we have the SEC going off and writing, essentially what we have here are lobbying disclosure rules, campaign finance rules, the agency, one, is going to get a political reputation that won't do it any good. And two, it's going to be sidetracked from its main mission. We have an agency that does campaign finance rules and reporting. That's the Federal Election Commission.
Right, but the FEC, all six of the FEC commissioners, all six of the FEC commissioners' commission have just expired, and they're all now operating on pretty much emergency rules. And still, even so, they're always deadlocked 3-3 on pretty much any campaign finance thing that comes to them. So if this does touch and concern publicly traded corporations, how come the SEC doesn't have any influence?
Well, first of all, that's not true. The FEC has most of the votes, over 90% of the votes they take on matters are done by a majority vote. And there's a good reason for this, which is we don't want sensitive First Amendment freedoms being decided by whoever is in power at the FEC. In the Nixon White House, I'm sure peace activists would not have liked the Nixon administration controlling interpretation of the campaign finance laws. And likewise, today, a lot of progressives probably would not want a Karl Rove appointee deciding what is legal and what is not. So that's why we have an agency where there's where a political party of one side or the other can't be deciding what the rules are. And I think that's a good feature. It's not a problem. It's an actual protection.
Liz, looks like you're about to speak up. You can here on HuffPost Live. You don't have to wait for me to call on you.
I would like to, thank you, although we were actually muted. But I think, it's interesting that you bring up Watergate because, of course, the SEC did actually require corporations to explain how they had been involved in political spending after Watergate. And in fact, we saw the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act implemented after some of that disclosure. But even in more recent years, we've seen them wade into, making important disclosures necessary and into the field of campaign finance when they passed rules with municipal bonds and other issues about when pension fund people that are deciding how pensions can be invested and how they can interact and take campaign finance contributions. So this is absolutely something that they've done before. But what's important to remember is this is not just do they have the authority to do this? They really have the responsibility to ensure that investors in these public companies are receiving the information that they need. Transparency is a bedrock business value, and that their companies are required to disclose a lot more than merely profit and loss statements. Of course, they're also required right now to disclose their executive compensation packages. And in fact, shareholders have the right to vote on those packages in some instances. So really, it's a situation where in America, everyone should have an equal chance and an equal say. But here, investors don't have the chance to say anything about the way the companies they're invested in may be spending money in politics because they don't even have that information.
That's totally not true. There have been probably well over 100 shareholder proposals at this point, where shareholders have proposed the types of disclosures that are being proposed by this rulemaking petition. And in almost every single instance, the shareholders have voted them down. They don't seem to be interested in this information. But nevertheless, I say we let the shareholders decide whether this is something the company should disclose or not. And we're not talking, first of all, we're talking about if it's true campaign contributions, this information is already public. If a corporation makes a political expenditure to support a super PAC, for example, that's already disclosed by the Federal Election Commission. Now, corporations, of course, at the federal level cannot support candidates directly, but in some states, corporations can do that. And where they can do that, that information is also publicly disclosed. So the real motivation behind this is not, and I'm not any particular person, but the real energy behind this is from groups that want to use this information to try to silence corporations from speaking out, either on policy issues before Congress, before the states, or on elections.
Well, so there are actually two important points that Jim's made that are important to clarify. So first, Jim has said
that was David speaking.
Excuse me?
That was David speaking. Haven't yet called on Jim. Jim will be there in a second, I promise you.
I'm sorry, David. My mistake. I think there are two important points that should be clarified. The first is it's been said now that all corporate political spending is already disclosed, and that's just actually as a factual matter not correct. Corporations can and do channel political spending, taking shareholders' money and putting it in intermediaries like the Chamber of Commerce, the American Petroleum Institute, a number of large organizations that are organized more or less for the purpose of channeling shareholder money to political debates. In a recent paper, Lucian Bebchuk and I measure how much money has been channeled secretly by corporations into politics over the last few years. We found more than $1 billion has been channeled in this way. And these donations, this spending is never disclosed to investors in any way. But there's another point that's worth emphasizing here, and it's an argument that's frequently made. The argument is the Securities and Exchange Commission shouldn't get into this area because this is an area with political implications, and the SEC should stay out of it. And I think here we might agree that the SEC should promulgate this rule if it's necessary to protect investors. That is the only consideration that should drive the SEC as to whether or not they should grant our petition. And I'm troubled, and I think it's actually quite incorrect for opponents of the rule to suggest that they shouldn't make the rule because of politics. In my view, they should neither make the rule nor not make the rule because of politics. It would be equally improper, in my view, for the SEC not to proceed here because they speculate it might have political consequences for them, as it would for them to make the rule for political reasons. It's clear investors have been demanding this information for years. This is now the most popular subject of shareholder proposals in public companies, and the SEC would have every basis to move forward and make companies disclose the spending to their investors.
Now, Jim, David had mentioned when he was speaking about the perhaps infringement on First Amendment rights or the chilling of First Amendment rights of corporations that may be forced to disclose their political activities to their shareholders. Can you expound on that a bit? You've been someone who's pushed for corporate speech rights for quite a long time. You helped get Citizens United Supreme Court, several other referendum disclosure cases you've also been behind. Tell us how this would, in your mind, impact corporate First Amendment rights.
Well, ever since the state of Alabama wanted in the late 1940s the list of the members of the NAACP that were behind the Birmingham boycott, the Supreme Court has recognized that disclosure of the identity of supporters of advocacy groups, particularly controversial ones, would serve to chill the willingness of people to associate with those groups because they justifiably fear retaliation either by people in the general public or by politicians. I mean, Nixon's had an enemies list. Clinton had 1,000 FBI files of opponents illegally in the White House. And everyone knows it's involved in politics. You have to be careful about who you oppose or even who you support. Otherwise, you're going to, because you're going to be subject to punishment by those that don't like your choice. So there's no question that disclosure chills First Amendment rights, chills the willingness of people to associate with particular activities, and of course that's the whole purpose here. This is the most naked partisan effort really we've had in our history. Citizens United permitted both labor unions and corporations to speak out about their purposes. I mean, about the policies that they would support or the candidates that would. Of
course, for labor unions, at least if I'm remembering my case law correctly, the labor members have to opt into a political spending regime by their union, and shareholders must opt out of. Am I not getting this right?
Actually, in the Beck decision, it's quite the opposite. The labor unions can take the money from the labor union members and spend it, but they can get a refund, of $1.50 or something related to their dues if they have the wherewithal to hire a lawyer and pursue litigation against the union to get their $1.50 back. So it's not a very effective remedy. But if you'd let me finish my point, this is nakedly partisan because the liberals and the Democrats have been not complaining about labor unions now freed up to directly support candidates or advocate the election of candidates or calling for disclosure of their political spending, but corporations who they, of course, fear might actually support free enterprise and be opposed to the coming socialist state that the Democrats and liberals are supporting. And of course, this going to the SEC is, of course, only about corporations. Well, where is the comparable petition to get the NRLB to require the disclosure of political activity? Well, it doesn't exist.
I see you shaking your head, actually, Liz.
Okay. Can I just jump in here when you get it?
Nakedly partisan.
Well, and Jim, if you'll give me a second. So I believe, I have to say, I find much of that entirely disingenuous. First, it was left out that the Supreme Court upholds disclosure and has upheld disclosure extremely strongly and every time they've seen it.
And Liz, before and Jim, hold on a second. Before we get to that, I want to read a couple of slates here, both of Justice Thomas and Justice Scalia. We're going to go to Justice Thomas first. This is from his dissent in Citizens United, the one person speaking on this behalf. It was 8-1 otherwise. I cannot endorse the view of the First Amendment that subjects citizens of this nation to death threats, ruined careers, damaged or defaced property, or preemptive and threatening warnings warning letters as the price for engaging in core political speech, the primary object of First Amendment protection. Now, on the other side of this is Justice Antonin Scalia in a case called Doe v. Reed in 2009. I believe, Jim, you argued this, requiring people to stand up in public for their political acts fosters civic courage, without which democracy is doomed. Scalia is very pro-disclosure. Thomas is not. So on that point,
Actually,
when we're talking, both of them
Yeah.
were speaking in terms, at least Thomas, in terms of, say, the Prop 8 case or a Washington ballot measure where individuals are signing resolutions, right? And so individuals being cowed, individuals being intimidated, even if it's not constitutional to suppress that, or to suppress rather their disclosure. Individuals are very different from corporations, at least in terms of their power in the public sphere and their rather corporeality, I guess is the right word, that they're actually a body as opposed to a building.
And even in that case that you mentioned, in the Prop 8 case, the judge there said that the plaintiffs' attempt, their argument to suggest that they should be exempt from disclosure was fundamentally misstating the nature of their First Amendment right, which was, and the quote is, based on the concept that individuals should be free from even the legal consequences of their speech. That is simply not the nature of the right. Just as contributors are free to speak in favor of the initiative, so are opponents free to express their disagreement through proper legal means. And that is exactly what we're talking about here. Well, actually, what we're talking about here is just that investors ought to know what is being spent. The total red herring or straw man argument that corporations are somehow similarly situated to the black citizens in Alabama in the 1950s, I think is a stretch beyond where logic will take you. And that we all have to understand, criticism is not chilling speech and harassment. Holding people accountable is not harassment.
Efforts like Target and for making a contribution to a C4 that supported certain conservative policies. They launched the liberals launched a big boycott.
Sure.
I mean, now all sorts of groups have been protected in their with respect to their political activity because of this very kind of attacks that are launched on people and that chill political speech. When you have the government involved in outing people, then the question of whether or not that will chill political speech is an important question.
Jim, let me ask you this then. If it's a person who's being outed as a donor to one group or another, that's one thing, right? So if Sheldon Adelson wants to donate $11 million, so be it, right?
Of his own money.
But if he has shareholders who he's speaking on behalf of, that to me seems to be an entirely different animal.
Well, there is a rule that governs what people who manage corporations can do, and of course they are limited in their ability to conduct their activities to only things that are necessary to pursue the business purpose of the organization.
Right.
And there's no question. I mean, right now the government is passing out bailout after bailout to all these corporations. You can run to the federal government and get all sorts of multi-million, even multi-billion-dollar loans or grants to pursue your green energy and everything under the sun. Well, of course, the businesses have a legitimate interest in what the government is doing, what policies they're doing.
Well, and
they
Jim,
want the goodies. They don't want the regulations.
Well, Jim, it seems like what you're saying.
And to shut them up by imposing a political speech rule on them that is not imposed on the labor union just simply reveals the naked political purpose behind this.
Jim,
Liz, Robert, I know you have to respond. I know you want to respond. You're holding your thoughts, but David, I know you have to get out very soon. So I want to ask you one practical question to you. Rather, Robert, are you the one who has to get out in a moment?
I am. I'm afraid I'm teaching.
Okay. What is the this is what I asked in the beginning. What's the practical significance of disclosing to shareholders when most shareholders in major corporations aren't people like us sitting here? It's institutional investors, Fidelity Investments, who hold shares on behalf of those who do business with them. So and I can't imagine that they'd be so inclined, unlike the 500,000 who've written in public comment to the SEC, to say, oh, we object. So what really is the practical significance when individuals really, like you and me, aren't going to those shareholder meetings, aren't lodging their complaints in this kind of way?
So I want to say two things about that, and I'm very sorry to have to drop off. The first thing I'll say is a few others have suggested that labor unions not having to disclose should be relevant to this calculus. I want to say two things about that. First of all, if you look at what labor unions have to disclose right now about their political spending, they have to fill out an enormously detailed disclosure. Comparatively, corporations have to disclose nothing about the types of contributions.
Are union members going to vote on this?
Jim, let Robert finish.
Go ahead.
That's the point.
Jim, please let Robert finish. Thank you.
To answer your question more directly, thanks. You're asked, well, what significance will this have? Because institutional investors may not want to change directors or change the corporate management because of evidence of this kind of spending. And the answer is we just don't know. I mean, for the reason that you asked, many folks have advocated much broader reforms than disclosure, giving shareholders a vote on political spending, requiring certain directors to oversee political spending. But the truth is we don't know what investors might do in response to this information because all of this shareholder money is spent on politics in the dark. And so I think as a practical matter, what you'll find is that over time, as institutions learn about political spending and what kind is good for the corporation and what kind is bad for the corporation, they will develop a view about what kind of political spending they can support. And I want to just note that this is in no way unprecedented. This same thing happened with respect to executive compensation 20 years ago. Many folks argued then that investors wouldn't be interested in executive compensation. And in fact, it turns out that the kinds of institutions you mentioned have strong views about executive compensation. And I think if the SEC does the right thing and gives investors information about how their money is spent on politics, the very types of institutions you're describing will use that information to hold directors accountable when they spend shareholder money on politics.
I would also like to add that Citizens United assumed that these mechanisms of shareholder accountability would in fact be in place. So this is really a logical response from the SEC to the entirely changed campaign finance circumstances that we find ourselves in after Citizens United. They assumed transparency would be there. The court wrote, prompt disclosure of expenditures can provide shareholders and citizens with the information needed to hold corporations and elected officials accountable for their positions and supporters. So this is no more radical than the Supreme Court would be in saying that this kind of information is necessary and is expected and that investors have a right to it.
David, you've been quiet for quite a while. I'm going to let you wrap this one up, all right?
Well, look, the investors can get this information now. They've had many opportunities to do so. Investors themselves can bring up a resolution to have all this information disclosed to them. They have in almost every instance said they don't want the information. And I also want to say this is going far, when we hear the word political spending, this is going far beyond supporting or opposing candidates. This type of disclosure that a lot of groups are talking about, they want the corporations to disclose also their lobbying expenditures, the trade association dues and things like that. And it's really aimed at trying to take money out of these trade associations, to make these trade associations weaker, to subject these corporations to boycotts for giving money to the National Association of Cable TV Broadcasters or the National Chamber of Commerce, national associations of all kinds of organizations. These associations clearly provide useful public information both to Congress and the public. And the real aim of this is to just gut these organizations. That's really what is going to be done with this information. So I say, look, the shareholders have the right to vote to require this now. I think every company should make its own decision if they want to do it or they don't want to do it. Some companies may want to do it, some have, and I say fine. If that's how they want to run it, great. But let's not have the SEC get off the track. The track is they should be protecting investors from frauds like Madoff. They did a lousy job on that. They have a big rulemaking on their plate for the Dodd-Frank bill, and if they spend time on stuff like this, which really isn't very important to protecting investors and efficient markets, they're just going to get winding up in politics.
It's very important to the 500,000, to the 500,000 American investors, retail investors that came in. But retail investors, almost half of American households own stock through their 401ks. 500,000 comments into the SEC in support of this very simple rule that corporations, when they spend your money on politics, should have to.
You have not read these comments.
Have I read all of them? I have read many of the comments.
All misinformed.
Oh, come on! These comments are from the Council of
David, I went through a good amount of these before we went on the air, and I pulled up a couple, and a lot of them are saying similar things, but I haven't actually. I was checking to see whether they're form letters, because I'm aware of form letters blasting the agencies, and most of them I read were quite different in their length and their content.
The treasurers of New York and California, $690 billion under management from one coalition of investors. I think that it's a disservice to write off all of the investor voices that are raised to say we deserve to know the corporate political spending that is going on. And it's not all transparent. You know that there were over $300 million dark money in the 2012 elections, and actually to a point that Jim made. The Target spending example was problematic, I think, for some people because they may have seen this spending as going against some of Target's publicly stated values and policies. So really the point here is to have more considered decision-making internally. I think that, Bruce Freed from CPA makes that point very well.
Actually, you're distorting even what happened in the Target case. And this is part of the problem with these disclosures. They're going to be used to distort things and push. And
you're suggesting it's better done without any kind of sunlight and just possibly by managers who are not having to go through.
I didn't say that at all.
I think let me sum up what I think you guys are saying. Hold on, because I do have to wrap. Let me sum up what I think you guys are saying. David, you're saying it should be the shareholders' choice whether or not to force disclosure from the board of directors and the corporation to the shareholders what they're spending. Liz, you're saying what the SEC is or the petitions to the SEC you're hoping to do is proper. Jim, I know where you stand. We can hear your Supreme Court arguments on OEA.org. You've supported anonymous donations. All of you guys, and anonymous petitioning too. All of you guys, has been an excellent conversation. I wish it could go on forever. The SEC will act soon. We'll follow it up here. I promise. Thank you all. Liz, David, Robert, dearly departed Robert, who had to go, and James. Jim, thank you guys very much. This is HuffPost Live.
You're welcome.
Conversation will continue.
Thank you. Have a good day.